The information provided is not a substitute for legal and other professional advice where the facts and circumstances warrant. People should always consult their own legal or other professional advisors and discuss the facts and circumstances that apply to their specific circumstances. The information shared on Ask the Landlord is for educational purposes only.
Hi everyone, we're back with another episode of Ask the Landlord with our favorite landlord, Albert Dweck. I'm Melissa. I'm one of Albert's producers and a former New York City, Pittsburgh, and Lafayette, Louisiana renter. And together, we're going to be asking this landlord some questions. Today, Albert, here's my question. What happens when a landlord sells the building that I'm living in?
Oh, I thank you for asking that question, Melissa. And I'll bet that's on people's minds. And I think, what I think about is people want to be secure in their homes, right? They want to know they're going to be okay. I mean, that's just like, it's hard enough to work and make a living and all that. And it's like, then you have to worry about where you're living. It's like, really, it needs, your home needs to be a place where you're like safe and happy. And it's like, peaceful, and when that gets interrupted, it can be very disheartening, stressful, etc. A few things. First of all, it depends where you live. Most of the time, I'll come back to that, but you have a lease agreement, and your lease agreement as a resident governs your tenancy. So the new owner has to abide by the lease that's in place. So if the lease says, I have 6 more months left on my rent or lease, then you don't have to worry about being displaced or anything like that. Now, there are rules in different places for the end of the lease, or if let's say it's not a residential a building, and let's say you're in an office building. Those are things that I've seen where landlords put in like what's called a demolition clause. This is not a residential thing, right? But I've seen it in commercial spaces like offices where the landlord tells the office client, hey, you have a lease, but one day we might want to fix the building or do something. So we have a certain, we can vacate you given a certain time frame and notices. Okay. So residential leases don't have those kind of clauses. Usually you're protected by the lease you have. And then in many states, New York City, if you're in a free market apartment, so you have to abide by the lease that you have. But if you're in a rent stabilized apartment, you have the right to just continue to stay there. Right? So you never have to worry about moving. Plus, in New York, again, if you're in a rent stabilized apartment and you have family members that live with you, they even have succession rights. So, you really don't have to worry about moving. Now, new ownership always causes a new situation. Like, Melissa, you do things in your house the way you do them. I do things in my house the way I do them. And I have my rules. You have your rules. Everyone runs their property households differently. So a new owner might have different rules, might have different people, might have a different requirements. Even though you have a lease, they might say, okay, you got to call this number, and this is how we're going to work, and this is who is going to work on the property. Okay, so those are new things to get used to, and you may or may not like them, but as long as you're getting taken care of, and the landlord has to uphold his end of the bargain that he bought from the other owner. Like basically, he bought the rights to collect the rent from you, and he has to keep the contract that is had with you, right? But also, when new owners buy properties like that, very often they maybe want to do something else with the apartment or whatever. So there's usually it presents some opportunity for you to have a conversation with the landlord about, hey, I see you bought the building. What are your plans for the building? How could I help? Oh, one owner would say, I'm going to buy the building and make improvements and this and that. Those are good things to know about. Usually that happens. So there's someone who buys a building has plans for it. And it's good to know sort of who that is, what they're doing and why, so that, it's going to affect you in some way.
Yeah, no, that
Is
makes
that
a lot of
helpful?
sense. I think you're touching more on the fact if the owner changes during the building, but let's say they want to make improvements and get rid of all the tenants. What happens in that situation? How many days notice do you have to give?
Well, you haven't, you have, again, it's different for, I didn't mean to cut you off. Because you have a lease. If you have a lease, they have to abide by the lease, right? So it's not, there's nothing that can be done typically around that, right? Now, it doesn't mean that the landlord can't ask you or make you an offer, or it doesn't mean that you can't make the landlord an
What does
offer.
that offer look like? Like, what's an example of an offer a landlord could make?
Well, let's say you have a 5-year lease.
You're right.
I'm just saying, which happens, right? You like the place, you're there, you have a 5-year lease, and the landlord, whatever, is a new landlord, and they don't want, and you sort of know their plans, and you're like, listen, I see, you want to do something with the building, and I have a 5-year lease, and I intend to stay, but I'd be willing to go if you made a deal with me that made it worth my while, because I have to find an alternative place to live, and I'm thinking of going to Florida, whatever. Then there are other situations where landlords want to do different things with the property, and you're in possession, right, of the place, and really possession as is 9/10 of the rule, especially in New York, where it's very hard to get tenants to move, despite what the law is. So landlords would, you know might be incentivized, depending on their plan and the timing, to uh, do a buyout,
So, what does a
essentially.
buyout mean? Can you explain what that
Um,
is?
so just it's just like money to leave.
And how do they get that? Like, where
You
does the
know,
number
um,
come from? Does the tenant decide? Does the landlord decide? Like, who creates that? What makes it worth it?
it's usually based in some kind of. So the landlord usually, it has to work for both parties. Obviously, um, it can't. The depends on what the tenant, where the tenant's going to go, what they're going to do, what it's worth paying. Like, the landlord also has to decide what it's worth paying. You know, like, you have some buildings in New York City, for example, where you have some legacy tenants, and they're in like old buildings that are what used to be manufacturing facilities or warehouses, right? And landlords are converting those into like condominiums that are very expensive, right? So that you could see a buyout in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars, because the apartment, it could be worth more than that, right? So, but the landlord has to take into account, buying out the tenant, the timing, those costs, and it so there has to be a meeting of the minds as to, like, what the landlord's willing to pay versus what works for the tenant, where the tenant's going to go themselves, things like that. So those are, and then the buyout, in my experience, happens usually with attorneys, most often with paperwork, right? So it makes sure that everyone's rights are protected, and that the money's, usually there's an agreement drawn up, and there's a deposit paid, and then there's Melissa, you
Right.
don't move out tomorrow. Like, if I tell you, oh, you go, Albert, I'm here, I have a 5-year lease, and I know you might want the apartment, so if you pay me $50,000, I'll leave. Like, okay, good, I hear you. When are you going to leave? Well, I got to find a place. Okay, how long is it
Right.
going to take you to find a place? Oh, it's going to take you a month. Okay, so So let's make a deal. I'm going to sign an agreement. I'll pay you a deposit, and then I'll pay you the rest when you're ready to when you're moving out, and we exchange money
Mm,
for keys.
that's a good exchange
So those are, don't
on
forget
the
you're going
money
to have
you receive,
taxes.
right? Right, of course. Good, appropriate for
Sure,
yesterday's day,
sure.
right? So you mentioned
That's right.
legacy. Does it matter if let's say I'm living somewhere for only 2 years? Would I be like, could I be a candidate for a buyout if I'm in the right place, right time? Or is it, you mentioned legacies, or is it like someone who's been
Sure.
somewhere for like 20 years?
No, no. It depends on on the laws of the place or the unit. Uh, in various parts of the country, the unit is like rent stabilized or rent controlled until as long as you live there, right? So the landlord can't do anything beyond the certain threshold for the rents as long as you live there. So that, let's say in the last couple of years rents went up a lot in the last year. Maybe the landlord says, you know what, why don't I give you like a month free rent or 2 months free rent, and you'll leave, and then I'll fix the place up and make it more money. Like this in San Francisco and in California and stuff. The rents went up a lot, and you're like, and let's say you got a good deal during COVID. So those, in some municipalities, that they can only raise the rent as much as CPI, and maybe so CPI is like
What
6 or
CPI?
7%
Define
today,
that.
but
Perfect.
Consumer
Thank you.
Price
No, you're good.
Index. Sorry, look it up, Melissa. Let's look it up. Wait,
For the
I
listeners
appreciate what
out
you're saying.
there.
It's an important
All right, taking
consumer.
it to the internet,
Let's look up
everyone.
CPI. CPI. What is CPI? Consumer Price Index is a measure of the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. Okay, so and then what's the CPI rate right now? It says 5% or
Hmm.
like around there. Just to
Hmm.
give you
Right.
an idea, it's like inflation,
Okay.
consumer price index. Basically, it tells you uh, how much it's adjusted
Hmm.
inflation for inflation. That's the CPI, essentially.
Great.
So basically, let's say the landlord could only raise your rent a certain amount of money, which let's say in California, it's according to some consumer price index or some restricted number, but the rents for the market went up 25%, but the market he could only raise them 5%. So maybe the landlord would be incentivized to get a new tenant. I don't know, just to give you an idea, but that's sort of those things. And then there's math there. It's like, well, oh, you can get $2,000 more, and I'm going to be here for 12 months. You multiply, you could sort of figure out what makes
Yeah.
sense, what doesn't make sense, right? But and then you got to think about um, no one wants to be somewhere where they're not wanted. Also, like I
Hmm.
found that no one wants to be with people that they're not wanted to be with, and no one wants to um, be somewhere where they're not wanted. And I think that it's important for landlords and tenants to realize that they're in a what's called a symbiotic circle, right? They depend on each other, and it's not. And as we say on this podcast many times, it needs to be a
Hmm.
collaborative relationship, not
Right.
not
It's not
a
one
fight,
sided.
right? It's not one sided
Right.
either way, right? Whenever you're doing something one sided, it doesn't work
Hmm.
for anybody.
So, have you ever had, that you can recall off the top of your head, a situation where things went sour? Let's say you purchased a building or you had sold a
Of course,
building and the tenant was like not
of course,
cooperative. Like, what's something that our listeners can learn
yes,
from and just not do?
it happened. And we've discussed this in previous
We just, the
um,
elevator.
podcasts. Those things, things happen. I mean, I think that people have things going on in their lives, and you don't know
Hmm.
what's affecting them socially, emotionally, mentally. The landlords uh, and people have things they're dealing with, and very often that causes them to make mistakes, right? So I live by this rule, and I try to. It's called halt. Halt. Don't do anything. Halt. Stop. It's if you're hungry, angry, liquored,
Okay.
or tired, right? So think about, when you're interacting with people and why you're doing things, like you're in a long-term relationship with
It
your
is.
landlord.
It is a
You're in a
relationship. I
marriage,
think that's a
essentially,
really
with your
good word
landlord.
we should use more. Yeah.
Yeah. And your landlord's in a relationship with the tenant. So you don't, you have to be careful what you say. You have to be careful. You don't want to lose your cool with people,
Hmm.
both ways. Sometimes it becomes frustrating. Um,
And you don't want to burn
uh,
bridges. Like that's a huge one for me, right? Because you sometimes
no,
might need that reference letter from a previous landlord. You don't want to leave the apartment looking like trash. It's important that I like that. The relationship,
you will.
communication, that's the point of this podcast, right? Just to, in
Yeah,
every
that's right.
like aspect and corner of the tenant landlord situation, it's a relationship, it's communication, and that's why we're here on Ask the Landlord.
Pick up the phone and see what, have a meeting, listen to each other. I think what is Stephen Covey would say, uh, first seek to understand and then be understood. Right.
And
So
maybe
that's
we'll
what we
end
would
that
say.
one right there. Thank you so much, Albert. That was great. For more episodes, please subscribe to Ask the Landlord on your favorite podcast platform. We'd appreciate it if you left a review on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to watch the show, check out our Ask the Landlord YouTube channel. If you have a question for Albert, feel free to contact him on Instagram at @AskTheLandlord and check out his TikTok at @AskTheLandlord. Bridging the gap between landlords and tenants, this has been Ask the Landlord. Thanks for listening.